U.S. History, Chapter 13, the New Deal. So, the overarching question is, how did the New Deal respond to the ravages of the Depression and change the role of the federal government? So, when we look at the New Deal, when you look at FDR offers, keep in mind the three R's. Almost everything in the New Deal pertains to one of those three R's, and two of them are up there: relief and recovery. So, relief is getting things to the people who need them the most. Recovery is how do we grow ourselves out of the Depression? And the third thing is reform. How do we fix some of the problems that led to the Great Depression in the first place? And so when you look at how did the New Deal attempt to address it, it is through those three R's. So we'll look at FDR himself to begin with. We'll look at some of the programs that are part of the first New Deal and their immediate impact. And then we'll look at some of the criticisms of the New Deal and try and evaluate which ones are legitimate and maybe which ones aren't. So when we look at FDR taking charge, he's kind of an unlikely guy to be the person that people turn to, simply because he comes from a very old family, a Knickerbocker class from the days when New York was New Amsterdam, controlled by the Dutch. And so his family had come over very early on, and they are extremely wealthy, high social elite class. He is a rising star in the Democratic Party. He looks to be someone who's potentially going to be a presidential candidate at some point, and then boom, he's hit with polio, and that polio leaves him unable to really use his legs from below the waist. Now the thing about that is people then identify with FDR, who they typically wouldn't have because he came from a wealthy family, simply because he knew what it was like to struggle. He knew what it was like to try your best and try your hardest. He went through all kinds of therapy to try and regain the use of his legs, and it never came back to them. So in some ways, they can identify with that. And in large part of the reason why he was able to continue his political career is over his shoulder there, you see Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, and she kept his name in the newspapers and in social circles in the political realm and sphere. And so he was never really forgotten. So he was always kind of in the background. But when he runs for president, besides all the problems that Hoover had, he promoted this idea of optimism and persistent experimentation. Above anything, let's just try it. Let's do anything and everything we can to attempt to grow our way out of this. And when he surrounds himself with people to help him make decisions, he surrounds himself with an awful lot of diversity. You see African Americans, you see women. So there's a whole lot of firsts in his cabinet. And again, from the outside looking in, it does look like he wants a diversity of ideas. He wants all kinds of different groups of people to give him feedback to try and be able to figure this out. Now, the other thing is, these are all very successful and intelligent and well-read and well-educated people. So they're the brain trust. And again, by far, maybe the most important person here is his wife, Eleanor. By eyes and ears, what that simply means is she traveled the country, she talked to people, and she knew what it was like for Americans to be experiencing the Great Depression. And so she reports back to Franklin Roosevelt, these are the things that we're seeing, this is what the American people are going through. And so he has a very close connection to the American people through his wife, Eleanor. So when you look at polio and the vaccine, it's a disease that really doesn't exist in the wild. There's only a handful of places that it does. And so it goes to show what people can do when they use vaccines and are able to isolate and prevent the spread of diseases. When we look at these first 100 days and the three R's in action, he is going to hit the ground running. He is able to have this time, and he meets with his advisors. He says, what do we need to do from day one to regain the confidence of the American people? And the first thing that he does is the bank holiday. shuts down all banks for 4 days. And what he says is that these banks will still be able to give money out to companies so that they can have their payrolls and all that type of stuff. But then what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of these different banks. And the ones who are financially solvent, we are going to open them up right away. Those banks that can cover most of the loans and most of the deposits, we'll do a little bit of work with them, we'll shore them up, and when they reopen, you can feel safe that your money's there. And then they're going to work a little bit harder with those banks that are kind of in deep trouble and in some cases maybe not reopen. But as soon as they have this 4-day bank holiday over and done with, you see people putting money back into banks, and that is going to begin to kind of recover the economic system. The other thing he does is these fireside chats. He sits down, gets on the radio, and talks to the American people. He explains, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. And this is also where Eleanor kind of plays a big role, because then he is able to talk about the things that Eleanor has shown him or talked to him about. And then the American people, again, feel as though they have someone in there who is listening to them, who hears them, who's there to help them. When we look at reforming the financial system, FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that is what's going to guarantee that banks will have your money, that your bank account, your savings account is federally insured. And so that way, if you go to withdraw your money and the bank doesn't have it, your insurance will make sure that you get that. Now, it's limited. It's not all the money that you have. It's 250 or 500,000 today. I can't remember what it is. They recently kind of expanded it. But, at least if you have $250,000 in your savings account, it's going to be there. The SEC, that is dealing with the stock market and the stock exchange, and that's overseeing that to make sure that some of the things like, for example, selling on margin, that it's not going to put the financial system at risk, and that's what they're doing. And when you look at the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, what that's going to do is it's going to try and help recover agriculture. So in this case, what they're going to do is they're going to pay farmers not to produce crops. Now, one of the things that's kind of controversial is in order to raise livestock prices, one of the things that they would do is they would destroy livestock. And here you have people around the country that are starving to death, and the government is paying people to kill and destroy animals that isn't going to be used for food so that the prices go up. So the AAA was pretty controversial from the very beginning. When we look at some other things that the first 100 days are going to do in terms of trying to get things recovered, the Tennessee Valley Administration is going to create a series of dams in rural Appalachia, and that's going to do a couple different things. One is it's going to put people back to work. When you're building these dams, you're putting lots of people to work. And the other thing it's going to do is it's going to provide electricity to some of these areas that are pretty rural and pretty remote. When we look at providing relief, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and these are all of the different Civilian Conservation Corps camps that you can see. And you see way up in northeastern Iowa, there were a few. One of them worked on Effigy Mounds State Park. There was one outside of Decorah that did Phelps Park. Also, I believe, built maybe the swimming pool, but that might have been a Works Progress Administration. I think it was a CCC. So anyway, they had camps up here, and they did all kinds of things, building small buildings, building parks, working on trails, those types of things. And it was available to young single men. And the idea is by having young single men working on the Civilian Conservation Corps, it would do two things. One is it would get these young men around the country, seeing the country, and getting paid. And it would take them out of the workforce so that way fathers didn't have to compete against these young single guys, so that the fathers could stay at home, get a job, and be able to provide for their families. For FARA and FHA, FARA is designed to get the economy recovering, the Federal Economic Recovery Act, and that is going to coordinate these different projects to try and get things going. And the Federal Home Administration is going to try and make sure that people aren't losing their houses, that they're going to have access to low interest housing and be able to provide more housing for people so that way they're not homeless. For industrial recovery, the National Recovery Act is going to help provide guidance, but it's going to also, for example, with the locks and dams on the Mississippi River, right? They're going to build those things so that way, with this Public Works Administration, you are getting all kinds of material, you're getting all kinds of workers, and you're going to help grow the economy out of the Great Depression through government guidance. When we look at opposition to the New Deal, you're always going to have opposition from the far right, far left. The far right says this is too much, we're becoming communist, we're becoming socialist, the government is too big, we're racking up too much debt, the government, because they're doing so much, is destroying liberty. For the left, they're saying, wait a second, this isn't doing enough because we are protecting banking, we're protecting big businesses, we're saving capitalism, which they felt had caused this thing in the first place. So either way, you're probably not going to make either of those extremes all that happy. Probably the people where he is getting the most criticism and probably the most challenge are some of these populist leaders. You've got Dr. Townsend, who thinks that we need to do something to take care of the elderly and the retired. And some of his ideas are going to kind of form the foundation of the Social Security Act. But his idea is we're going to give every old retired person $200 a month that they have to spend that month. If you don't spend it, then you don't get it. And what that would do is that would put money into the economy and help stimulate it. Father Coughlin's kind of a controversial figure. He is highly critical of FDR. He thinks that we didn't go nearly far enough. He's advocating that something that's a little bit closer to like socialism. And probably the most interesting of all of them is Huey Long. He is a political figure from Louisiana. He's governor and eventually senator. He kind of has an interesting background as to how he got into power in the first place. But once he's in power, he wants to use that to help the poor people. One of his suggestions is share the wealth scheme. Basically, take money from those people who are millionaires and then divide it up and give it to all of the Americans, the rest of the Americans who aren't doing that well. So that doesn't really go over all that great.